Yes. Good morning, beautiful people of the internet, as Jay would normally say. We've been left in charge by the lovely Piotr. Well, Jay's been left in charge. He's doing a smashing job. So my turn to kick off this week. And we're going to go through another epic Sunday supplement by Adam. And also, if you've seen my posts this week, we want to touch on kind of mental health, because that's been a real topic, and lots to say about that this week, particularly with kind of some of the stuff that I was doing when I was in London, going to the launch of Jack at Work. So we're doing the usual property, economics, and we're going to touch on the human side of property as well. So welcome, grab your coffees if you've not got it already, and yeah, we'll get started. Oh, and I forgot to welcome everybody. Jay Howard, in charge of technicalities today, and Mr. Adam Lawrence. And Piotr's with us in our hearts.
So just let me get this straight, Helen. Jay is Piotr, you are Jay, but I am me. I mean, there's some kind of rotational breakdown here.
No, you have to be me then.
Just checking everybody's awake, really, I suppose, aren't we? That's the that's the way it's going to roll. So I think, really, given our collective technical ability, which could be summarised in a very short sentence, we've done well to even get online. So we'll take it.
We've got a win already. Yes.
I think it's probably a relatively easy segue from the Bank of England into talking about mental health, because I'm not sure about theirs either, especially at the top level. But there we go. So it's another bit of an epic one this week. I've crossed the 6,000 word Rubicon for the second week in a row, so it was a bit much. But the problem is, once you picked at the scab, you just kind of had to carry on until it was off, really. So I did a bit of a macro summary of what's been going on in terms of the big bits of data in the economy and which sort of direction we're headed in, which is sort of sideways and a little bit downwards and a little bit concerning. You know, there's some particular interest, I suppose, the RICS house price balance figures, 46% net of all surveyors asked. So I think that means, is it 73% versus 27%? That market's going downwards in terms of pricing in nominal terms at the moment, but it's a really easy month to be bearish from what happened to the bond yields last month. And I don't really think July and August are going to cheer anybody up too much, because we're looking at a much more sort of seasonal style market. So the reality on the front line is stuff is selling. People aren't falling over themselves, unless it's something special, something rare, or something really well presented, which from the agents I speak to is still selling really, really well. So what it isn't is a market where you just turn up and get top price. But I mean, those markets are very rare. We happen to have one last year, and it's now long gone, But the Bank of England, the Financial Policy Committee, which we normally spend our time talking about a Monetary Policy Committee, because they set the interest rate. So their faces have respectively been on everyone's dartboards for the last sort of 18 months or so. But the FPC, twice a year, well, they only meet 4 times a year, and twice a year they release a report about the financial stability of the economy. And now there's obviously a number of things of interest in there, but particularly they've done some deeper dive analysis on the mortgage rates and how much just all this stuff will be going up, which is, as we always say, context is important, right? And if you listen to the news, you'd think that Armageddon was, has already been here, is still going on, and is coming tomorrow. Whereas the spoiler alert, really, there's a nice chart that I shared with the supplement today, is that ultimately the average UK household who's a homeowner with a mortgage is looking at about £220 a month increase in their mortgage payments. So I'm not trying to trivialize 220 quid a month, thick end of £3,000, but it's not the figure I would have guessed if I was asked to pick it out of thin air, given the amount of circus that's been made by the media. And it's not the amount that the gas bill went up by in about October last year, when even with the price cap in place. So, we've survived that. Those prices have come back down, and we've been benefiting from those since the 1st of July, as the price cap's sort of been phased out, but also prices are legitimately down on utilities. Food prices are coming down. Everything inflationary is coming down, apart from services pricing, which is great, apart from the fact that services pricing makes up 47% of our inflationary indices. But there is easing, and this slight surprise in unemployment figures is helpful from last week. So as fewer vacancies are out there and as people start to lose jobs, it is going to stop the acceleration. And we've obviously had as well in the past week the certainly mooted settlements for the public sector workers varying between 5 and 7%. So that's not kept up with inflation, but it has probably at least done enough to stop full-scale social unrest on that side of things. And expectations, I would expect in the next few months, will start to come downwards, not upwards. But I had a bit of a dig at the bank, really. And look, I appreciate we live in our little bubbles, don't we? And what's important to us and what's relevant to the vast majority, I'm sure, of people who are listening to this is the UK property market and the investment property market side of things. So there's now this stat, which I'm having difficulty with because I can't dig into where they've got it from. But they're saying about 2 million of 5.5 million buy-to-let properties have got mortgages on. So 3.5 million are unencumbered. Now, again, we live in our own little bubble, partners in property. We've got aspiring investors, experienced investors. We don't have too many in the room who are completely unencumbered. I'm not saying we have none. There are some out there. But it feels to me like nearly 2/3, 60-odd% unencumbered buy-to-lets feels it just feels wrong to me. And I'm not sure that they're counting buy-to-let mortgages for limited companies as well as individuals, as well as commercial loans against property, which wouldn't be classified as buy-to-let mortgages. And I don't think they can be. I really, really don't think they can be. So it throws those figures out, which means all the analysis they derive from that is also probably wrong. But even if that was correct, right? Even if it was correct, then what about new buy-to-lets to the market? There was a great graphic that was shared this week. I think it was on the BBC website, actually, where they looked at demand versus supply in the rental markets over the last 5 years. And hey, guess what? Supply is fairly drastically down between about, I think in the East Mids, it was up 4% versus the 5-year average. Everywhere else it was down. And in the Northeast, I think it was down about 34% or something like that. But the supply side is even worse. So the demand from tenant demand, the demand side is much worse. So the tenant demand side, I think in Scotland, tenant demand was up 86%. And it's perhaps no accident that the place where they've introduced the rent controls into law is the place that currently has the worst rental market from the tenancy perspective. And of course, it's your basic. We've seen this throughout COVID again and again. The one bit of economics that hasn't changed over the last 25 years, as pretty much everything else has since I've ever been studying it, is that, lower supply, higher demand, price goes up. There's no two ways about it. And obviously last week's work looked at affordability and how it was, and whether it was still there and all the rest of it, which it dramatically is, by every measure that I used. So I think the bank have kind of glossed over that side of things a bit, although they don't tend to worry too much about the property side of things. It's a bit of a difficult one, isn't it? Because the bank are in charge of the interest rate, obviously, but they don't really have too much of a remit on the property side of the equation. So even though you've had this very quick uplift in rates again and again and again and again and again, they're not too bothered about the housing market. Yeah, they know it needs to be in an orderly fashion to keep the economy relatively stable. But we're talking of a 115-page report. I think we had about a page on buy-to-let, really, and about 3 pages on households from the property side of things. the rest of the report is somewhat positive in the face of a relatively average / ropey time in the economy. There isn't as much consumer debt as there was. There isn't as much corporate debt as there was. A lot of the corporates last year stocked up massively at the beginning of the year on longer term debt. So where the households, and this is something that I've tried to break really, or certainly challenge in people's mentalities over the last 12 or 18 months. We have this, the concept of sunk costs, right? You spent a lot of time on something, so you shouldn't give up on it, but you're never going to recover those costs, so you shouldn't really be considering them, right? And there's a lot of disagreement about, the old winners never quit and quitters never win, right? But selectively quitting can actually be the best strategy quite a lot of the time, because if none of us have ever given up on anything, we might still be, I don't know, partying all night, or whatever the analogy would be, right? So the interesting thing about the way the whole market is going on that side of things is we have this fixed idea in our head that we shouldn't pay early repayment charges. It's almost like it's not an option, not even an option to pay them. And it's like, well, yeah, but if they're 1 or 2%, and you could save yourself 5 to 10% to fit. Well, I've ended up saving what looks like 20 to 25% over the life of a 5-year mortgage by paying some of the 2% and 3% fees I paid last year, right? You have to challenge these things. Now, the corporates, I think the CFOs make those decisions a lot more easily than individuals do, which is not a surprise. It's why the CFOs get paid the big bucks. So they went, do you know what? Debt's really cheap. They were raising funds at 2% and things like that. Let's just do that for 10 years, right? Whereas now we've got this different situation where if you look at what the banks are advertising at the moment, most of the high street banks at the top of their list to push out on the mortgage side of things is a 10-year fix. And it's kind of this cart and the horse where, hold on, do you want to close any more stable doors after the horse has bolted? Would have been nice to be pushing those 18 months ago. Now you're having to push them at 5%, which might not be the greatest rate over the coming 10 years. It's really, really quite difficult to predict. I mean, obviously, the bond markets do their best, but they also change quite a lot around the price of the 10-year debt. But it's just to get under that affordability. So that's probably the cliff notes, really. The only other couple of bits I probably wanted to pick out are there's some unsurprising stuff in there, like 15% of people who've refinanced in the last year have also kicked out their term. So they've gone from a 25 or a 30 or a 35 to add more years on. So that's keeping their payment down. And the real nuance for people to get their head around is with repayment mortgages, a really, really simple back of the fag packet example in this morning's efforts. If the payment's £1,000 a month, but it's £500 capital and £500 interest, right? And then also you kick the term forward a bit as well. The £500 repayment doesn't change. In fact, it goes down. Let's say it goes down to £400, right? And if the interest doubles, the 500 goes to 1,000. That leaves you with a total of 1,400. So you're paying 1,400 instead of 1,000. It's 40% increase. If you're paying 1,000 and the interest rate doubles and it's interest only, it goes to 2,000. And you've got no term. You've got no way of getting that down because you haven't got a repayment term to throw out there. So you've just got a really nasty situation. You've got this increasing pile, and they didn't refer to this at all because I don't think they understand the nuances. But where they just see it as, look, if landlords have got two choices really: drag the tenants along with them and put the rent up, or sell the properties. If they sell too many, that could put the housing market in. It could impact the housing market in terms of there's more stock. It could send the prices down, right? The banks historically always said this, but there's limited evidence that landlords want to let go. And most, and let's face it, if they're right and 2 million are unencumbered, 2 million are encumbered and 3.5 million are unencumbered, those unencumbered players have been in the game for a long time. They've seen worse times than 2023, right? They know that it's time in the market, not timing the market, as dear old Uncle Warren would say, and therefore they're more likely to hunker down. right, and or pay down debt if that's what they need to. Obviously, active, growing property businesses who are more likely to be using leverage have also likely got access to equity or cash, right? If it's equity, that's going to be a way that people need to look at to grow their businesses from here on in a safe and sustainable way if they don't want to pay 7% plus interest rates. And it's a great time to be looking at equity sharing rather than debt, or at least changing the balance of all of that. But I'm going to say a bit more about all of that next week. But I think the report is I mean, it doesn't read incredibly positively, but it wouldn't at the moment. And bear in mind, it's a financial stability report, so it has to look at stress test conditions and stuff like that. But really, the tail of the tape is it's nowhere near as bad as we might have been led to expect. But we still have to put up with this sort of constant barrage of bad news stories every 2 minutes in terms of the market. And you're much better off really to get a good idea of what's really going on at the coalface by listening to Ben Beadle from the NRLA when he's talking to Parliament than you are by reading the Bank of England report, because it kind of lives on this very high level of macro where, well, massive companies aren't really in trouble, but 99% of us don't live our day-to-day lives by the future and fortunes of a massive company. A small number of shareholders do. A lot of shareholders don't even understand that they are shareholders because it's index funds and it's ISAs and it's pensions and it's all the rest of it. So it doesn't really explain too much to the person on the street, I suppose, which kind of, I think, hopefully leads us relatively nicely into how are you supposed to deal at the moment with the fact that day by day there's another crisis, and this mortgage crisis has been proven to be £220 a month to the average household. I'm not trying to trivialize it, but what's the average? Why are we not talking about the average pay rise for the average household? If we're going to put it into context, there doesn't seem to be any want to even try and be positive. And the one thing we will miss from having lost to Boris is that, I mean, the man's a compulsive liar, but he was always very positive and he believed strongly in the economics of boosterism and coming out. And, there's only one gear really when you're trying to show leadership qualities, is that we're going forward. Yes, it might be tough and we've got to work through it, but we're going forward. But how do you process that with so many, whatever channel you're looking at, whatever, even if you don't watch the news, if you use social media, you kind of do these days, don't you? You kind of do watch the news because it's really difficult to avoid.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody's successfully managed to avoid the news on social media and how you would go about that. I mean, I suppose I kind of like it because it gives you I've always said I like it because it gives you an idea of what other people are thinking. That's why I like talk radio stuff. That's why I like LBC and whatever, because you can get, it's a I was going to say it's a dipstick test, but maybe that's the right way to describe it.
That could depend on the presenter and who's called in. Before we go too far in, we've got a really good question. How do I now show this question? There we go. There we go. Look at this magic. Morning all. Well, this week
you're in trouble. You're in trouble, Piotr.
That's it. We've got rid of our Polish connection. We've got this done now. So Humble Family Travels. Morning all. Will this week be profanity free, or shall I get my headphones? Humble Family Travels. You never know what's going to happen in life. As with this call, it could take a turn to Smutsville. It could also take a turn to a profanity-filled rant of epic proportions. So I would, if you have children under the age of 16, or if you're a little bit more Puritarian than that, under the age of 18, I would certainly recommend getting the headphones in. Anything can happen. Absolutely anything. Yeah, that's a brilliant comment.
Guarantee anything. Yeah.
So, to be fair, full credit to Jay for answering that without profanities in the answer. So,
yes.
It was highlighted that perhaps the audience in that area would not be suitable for such things, and got to respect some boundaries, people.
Well done.
But before we move on to the mental health chat, just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that you said, Adam. One of the things is understanding how leverage works. And it must have been about 2015, 2016, and I was talking at a property event. Not your illustrious event, of course, far less reputable and well put together event. I'm not going to name it; it'll be unfair. But it's got far too many P's in it for me. That's beyond. No, I'm not going to go any further than that. Anyway, so I'm there, and I'm supposed to be talking about how to do all, which my personal opinion is it's impossible. But what they generally mean when they say no money down is you're using other people's money. So it was just a case of structuring the talk around that. I think the talk was an abject failure because I spent most of the time digging at the whole principle of no money down. So, which explains why I haven't had an invite back anytime soon. But one of the things that was being discussed at the time was interest-only mortgages. So I used to work with a chap who was an estate agent for about 20 odd years. Been in the game, and every time he saw something nice, probably on with a rival agent, he'd buy it. And this is like going back to like 2004 to 2012, he'd be getting like 100, 120% mortgages, blah, 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 all interest only. And he only bought in 3 postcodes in London. So he knew whatever the story was, that the capital appreciation on those assets was going to wipe out he was always going to be up, essentially. Like, depending on when he dropped out, he was always going to be up because it doesn't matter that the capital price didn't go down. All he had to do was manage the interest rates. And actually, probably for the last 10 minus 3 years, he's probably done exceptionally very well with that. I've been thinking I might have to give him a call to see if he, fixed for longer or if he started doing capital repayments, or I think he was going through a period of diversifying the portfolio. So he may have got rid of some of the bits that hadn't netted down well over time. But do you hear that very often, Adam? Like people just thinking, well, I'm buying something for less than £100,000. I may as well just go interest only. Or I'm buying in a sustainable capital appreciation zone, so I'm just going to go interest only. Or is it a bit more nuanced than that?
I think it's a really good point. I think there's been this kind of wave that has changed since 2008 or around about then, where there was certainly a time, and maybe even endured for a while, certainly in London, where people didn't necessarily mind. I mean, bear in mind that the mortgage market regulations around stress testing and all that, although the review was 2012, they didn't actually kick in till about 2014. So it was still a bit more Wild West, although there's obviously been a big crunch in the credit that was available, and the people behind the lenders were not providing the money that they were. And there'd been all these, let's call them relatively generous day one valuations. I think that's the right way to refer to it without kicking off any lawsuits or whatever. But I think we were cultured into, and you still get the phrase today, don't you? Property's my pension, right? Now, pensions historically take money out of your pay packet in the now, and then they're putting it in a pot to save for the future. So people didn't have an issue, certainly pre-08, with properties that were negatively cash flowing, and they were supporting them from other income that they had. I mean, obviously not necessarily professional property investors, although, of course, you could. I mean, we've historically supported quite a lot of negative cash flow properties. If we bought something on a bridge and it's empty, it needs a refurb, it's negatively cash flowing until you've got it tenanted and on term finance. But we've balanced it off against the rest of the snowball, which has been growing, which is tenanted and is income producing. So there was a mindset shift sometime between about 08 and about 14, where and some of that was then forced by the regulatory landscape, where you couldn't get mortgages that were going to be negatively cash flowing every month unless you were going to leave properties deliberately empty or something like that, because the rules wouldn't allow it anymore. So the idea that you put money in or you didn't have big cash flow went away. And then, of course, if you refinanced your whole, let's say you were an utter genius and you refinanced your entire portfolio in 2021, at 2.8% or whatever you could have got at the time, you know, at that point you would have been very used to significant cash flow, and you'll be very used to it until, assume that was done for 5 years, 2026, when you're going to get one hell of a shock when you come for a refinance, right? Because it ain't likely to be 2.8 or whatever. So I think it's a bit of a cultural. We've got cultured into. We've started enjoying cash, and if you refer to however many P's there were in that property meeting you were presenting at, Jay, that they and others have pushed cash flow as the answer, and kind of left cap app on the back burner. Whereas, as we know, there's a lot of reasons why cap app is a big percentage of your total returns over time, right? Number one, inflation, house price inflation, as we've talked about, although it isn't normally the way that it's framed, but that is the truth. You know, money devalues over time, houses go up, you've got nominal fixed debt, and you've got a real asset underlying with utility. That's why it works, right? Yep. And then also the taxation efficiencies of holding, because if it goes from 100 grand to 105 to 110 to 115 in 3 years, you're not paying tax on those latent gains, just like you wouldn't if you had a share in a company and you buy it at £10 and it goes up to £20. You'll pay it when you sell, right? But the difference between the share in the company, generally speaking, is that with the property, if it goes from 100 to 115, you can access 75+% of that gain by refinancing. And so there's cap, and when you start using, I mean, whether you use companies or in your personal name, you know, that money comes out without a taxation implication to it. Now, if it's in your personal name, there's nothing stopping it from getting spent. If it's in the company, it at least has to come out of the company, and it can't come out of the company on the basis of a dividend because it's not a profit-making exercise, right? So sometimes the company helps people conduct themselves a little bit better, I suppose, in terms of all of that. We've all seen many people, I'm sure, have refinanced and gone off and bought the Ferrari or whatever. And obviously you could do it through the company, but it's going to be a hell of a benefit in kind if you do. So I think people have been sort of coached into this new world of, well, property means cash flow, and therefore we want to keep that cash flow going. Now, the only way at the moment to force that cash flow is to knock the rents up in accordance with how much the interest rates are going up if you are one of the leverage. So I don't know that people really do it by area necessarily. I always say to people, look, I don't like repayment generally because it puts a shackle around things, and it's quite tax inefficient in a company because you've got to pay corporation tax on your profits and then your repayments will be taken out of the mixer. If instead you had interest only across the board, most mortgages will allow you to pay down 10% per annum without an early repayment charge. Pay down 1 or 2 of 10. Let's say you've got 10. Your aim really should be to get 1 unencumbered first of all, probably the lowest yielding. If you've decided that's one that's worth keeping because of capital appreciation, rather than trying to pay them all down on a repayment basis, because it just leaves you relatively asset rich and cash poor, which is the classic landlord problem. You know, pay it off when it makes sense to pay it off. We've got cash at the moment, you know, and we've got one property where it slid through the cracks 3 times on mortgage applications in the last 14 months or so. And at the moment it's on an SVR of 10%. And I'm just looking at it thinking, why is the bank getting 10% there? Now, bear in mind, we get corporation tax relief against the 10%. So we're actually paying 7.5 or something like that. But still, it's a big number. And it could be better off in our pockets than it would be in anybody else's. I've got the dreaded overheating phone. Oh dear, I may have to run to the fridge.
Stick it in the freezer for 5 minutes.
It works. You'd be surprised.
Well, I think that's pretty good. So, Helen, you've done some really good posts this week from last Sunday's chat when we mentioned let's do a little chat about mental health and staying positive and, you know, keep on keeping on, that kind of thing.
Yeah, this was all because when I was in London, I went to the launch of Jack at Work, and it's JAAQ. You can check it out on Insta or any social media platform you like. Oh, we lost him. I love that his phone overheats and he's in Solihull, and I managed not to in Malta, but there we go. Bless him. And yeah, so this is kind of like a mental health. It's an app and a website, and it's an interactive tool. Actually, this was the launch of the kind of the corporate one that's been rolled out to Bupa, NatWest. There's a whole list of like good quality clients that's been rolled out to, but actually there's a free version that anybody can access. And it's interactive in the sense that you go on it, and whatever question you've got about, and it's very broad in terms of mental health. So it can be about depression, anxiety. But the guy who founded it, Danny Gray, actually himself has body dysmorphia. So there's a whole topic around that, particularly pertinent for me. They have a whole section on menopause, which is really interesting and definitely something that should be talked about more, because it doesn't just affect the person going through it, it affects everybody around them. So you kind of type in whatever question you've got, it comes up with suggestions, and the expert, and they have world leading experts on this platform, they answer you. They've recorded hours and hours and hours of content giving answers to all kind of like common questions, and they answer you directly. So it's not type it in and you get a text back. You've got somebody speaking back to you and explaining kind of resources or how to cope with this, or where you can look, or things that you don't need to be worried about that, or dispelling myths. So it's such a great tool, given that, as Adam was talking about there, a lot of the headlines and the scare stories come without context. And it's something you always talk about, Jay. Context is everything. And when you don't have context for numbers in that case, or in the mental health kind of side of things, perhaps physiological or symptoms, if you don't have context of, is this normal, is this not normal, should I be worried about this? If you don't have that, then that's where stress or anxiety, or you can get yourself in knots. And it's just such a great tool. It's free to be able to access information, quality information, to give you that context, to just give you that kind of reassurance, or provide further information, further resource that you can investigate yourself. It's empowering you, to find out more and give you that context, which then just like kind of calms everything down. So yeah, that's why it's kind of on my radar, because we when I was back in London, so that was a couple of weeks ago, we were recording the new program for property TV, which will be on Sky 186. Don't quite know when it's going to be shown yet, but this Venture Visionaries. So Danny came in to talk to us about kind of funding, because they're in a seed round at the moment. So that's how I've kind of got on this topic. It's why it's on my radar at the moment.
Oh, brilliant. I think after kind of looking at the JAQ that you'd shared in some of your posts, clicked on a couple of buttons. I was going through some of the resources, and I sat back and I was thinking, I think I had suffered from burnout without realizing it.
Many people do. Yeah.
It was, I was working for an auction company, and I think there are two main parts of an auction cycle where it's flat out. Where pre-COVID, you used to print a catalogue, which meant you have to arrange all the lots, write all the details, get everything correct, blah, blah, blah. Then you'd have the auction week itself. We would say the auction day was the whole week around it, the logistics, the paperwork, all this stuff. And I was doing that for about 7 years, and it was about 7 or 8 auctions a year. So I was constantly living like these highs and these lows, these big dips.
Yeah.
It wasn't like a normal kind of job where it's kind of you go in and this is, okay, certain things come up and change. So you get these tiny little bumps. It was massive up and downs. And then I left there, and I was working just doing some business development stuff, and because it was still in the same field, I hadn't really picked up on the fact that I hadn't kind of got out of that cycle yet. So I was struggling to think of things to do.
Yeah.
And then I was becoming frustrated because I'm like, oh no, I'm far more capable. I was doing the job of probably 3 or 4 people. I think that's how many people they hired to replace me. But it was kind of like all of these different things. I was like, okay, now I'm feeling useless. And it's one of these things, you just go on this whole spiral. And then you start feeling, okay, well, actually, I'm doing this. And that's actually, I think that's impressive. So then you start going back up again. And then it starts going back down. And you realize it's a bit of a cycle, actually. And it's really difficult to pinpoint the start and the end of that cycle because it connects. It's just a big circle. So it becomes harder to go, right, how do I break this thought process?
Yeah.
So what I do now is really very different to what I've been doing the last 10 years. Still auctions, still real estate, but instead of like all of the logistical stuff, all of with regards to like paperwork and structuring things, I now do more of the relationship side of things, which I'm actually far more suited to. And that has, because a lot of those relationships take a while to build, because you need to kind of keep the communication. There can be some weeks where I think, right, I've achieved absolutely nothing. I'm completely useless. I shouldn't take any money for this month. I've wiped my hands for the last 2 weeks, blah, blah, blah. But then the reality is actually that's not the case. It's slightly slower burn work. And when you see the results of it coming through, you then start getting that, not justification, but you start getting, like a little dopamine award of, wow, this came off, or wow, that came off, and things like that. So I've gone through a real shift on that side of things.
Cool.
I
call that like planting seeds. You plant all these seeds and you don't go back and look. Like you plant sunflowers, you don't go back and look every day and see, but it just takes time. And then they start popping up one by one and you're like, oh, I'm so glad I did that. It felt like, God, nothing's happening, nothing's moving at the time. But then they start sprouting, and it's that dopamine, like, yes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've started just now, if someone crosses my mind, instead of thinking, oh, I should call that person, I call the person. Just call them now, because you never know what's going to happen. And I did that last weekend, and we're putting together a really interesting deal with that person. And it's strange because I don't think I've spoken to them for maybe 3-6 months, and just a freak conversation about a random property. And all of a sudden, the deal that's being put together is actually really quite special. Might share it another time when it's all done. But did you go through anything kind of similar to what I've explained when you left the trading floor, right? Because the trading floor, that's a crazy environment, right? And you went from that to like probably more in your own kind of sphere of, I'm going to be looking at these deals, I might invest here, and taking more control of yourself, I guess.
Well, exactly. And burnout, I really should have mentioned that burnout is one of the main topics and the main reasons like this Jack resource appeals to me, because for those who don't know, that's why I left investment banking, just burnt myself out spectacularly. So that gap between banking and going into property was 2 years of me sleeping kind of 20 hours a day and hardly leaving the house. So I have a very real experience of that. And actually, as you were talking about, sorry, I'm just having technical issues here. As you were talking about kind of the roller coaster of the auction cycle, like that was a daily thing for me, working on a trading floor, or certainly when I started because when I started, we were in the 90s, right? Late 90s, but we're still kind of, on phones. It was less electronic. Now you just push a button and still exciting, I guess. But that was all, you'd get everybody on the phones, calling out to brokers, trying to get deals done. It was like live on adrenaline. Like, I reckon my blood was probably I don't know what the average measure of adrenaline in people's blood is, but I reckon mine was probably 5 times the normal. You know, and I've written stuff about this before. You were just on from the moment you got there till the moment you left. You know, there was no lunch hour, no breaks. You want to go to the loo, you run, you do what you got to do, and you run back. It's just incessant. And to be honest, like, that appealed. I loved it. I thrived on that. But that takes a toll, a physiological toll on your body, particularly as a woman, which is very kind of un-PC to say, but it does, because we don't have the levels of testosterone that guys do. It takes more of a toll on a woman's body than it does on a guy. You can keep going longer. You have more kind of like physiological resilience than a woman does, purely biologically. So yes, I burnt myself out spectacularly. And now, you know, I've done lots of kind of courses, resources, training on trying to spot, because I just still have that tendency, but to spot when it's happening. And again, if people can educate themselves on that, and actually somebody commented on one of the posts I put out this week, and they're like, something, it just sparks something in somebody's mind, like, I think I'm on the edge of burnout. I'm like, yes, like if it's reached one person that they can look and go, oh God, is that me? Like, great. Now you have the opportunity to get in there and stop that downward spiral that you talked about, Jay.
Yeah.
And if you can get in there, rather than, particularly like when you work for yourself or you're entrepreneurial, I think because it all does come down to you, really, even if you've got a team around you, we just are that type, aren't we? We're like, you just push through, you just push through, you just push through. Worst thing you can do if you're on the edge of burnout. So identifying where you are in that stage, where you are in that cycle, is absolutely critical, because pushing through burnout, like, you just can't. You just can't. You might think you can, but you can't. And it's going to crash before you come up. And that recovery, honestly, I reckon has taken me, well, to the beginning of proper recovery took 10 years.
Yeah.
I just don't recommend that to anybody. That is not a productive use of time. It's really not.
It's like inflation. It goes up very quickly in terms of problems, then takes a long time to get rid of, right? That's the analogy. Yeah, I always remember a professor I had when we did a module on behavioural finance, which is a fascinating module during my MBA, and he'd written a paper about he'd contributed to this paper that was the famous conclusion was, 4% of CEOs are psychopaths or whatever, but really it's that they share some traits that are generally associated with psychopaths. And he said it was the most depressing thing he'd ever done in research, because he was approached by Goldman Sachs because they were interested in the findings, because what they wanted from him was to identify these traits because they were the people that they wanted to hire. And I was gonna say, Helen, do you think that, and some of this is obviously we're a lot more open about this stuff now, and we're talking about it, which is fantastic. There are also many more tech wearable devices to try and track a lot of the physiological symptoms that you were talking about, and that space is moving really, really quickly. You, I suppose it's a roundabout way of me saying, do you think, not to pick on Goldman's above anybody else, but do you think they will start to care about the fact that they kind of pick traders up and rinse them until they pop? Because it's not uncommon. I don't know what the average shelf life of a trader is, but I bet it's probably like 8 to 12 years, is it, or something like that?
Yeah, probably.
Do you think they will care and or see the commercial side of deliberately preserving the talents that they are able to spot in their early 20s, or do you think, don't be silly?
My true answer is don't be silly. But I think the HR department will care in terms of, we need to tick the "we are a good place to work" box. So being entirely cynical, which is so not unlike me, I think they will make improvements. And, you know, actually, one of Jack's clients is NatWest. So they are, you know, that's an example of a bank or like a corporation like that is putting stuff in place. And certainly, I mean, we talked about it last week, didn't we, during like 2008, and people jumping off, or bankers jumping off roofs in the city and things. I think when there's terrible things like that, and I actually know about one management consultancy as well, where they had somebody kill themselves, and then there's a sudden like, oh God, we really need to deal with that. Is it from a genuine place? I don't know, but almost like, does it matter as long as the resources are being put there and there is an attempt to help people? So whether it's genuine or whether it's to tick a box.
Well, I guess I'm kind of driving at, I think in these, I don't know how the conversations go between Jack and NatWest or whoever, but generally speaking, there's usually a bit of a commercial argument in these cases. I remember when I was in a corporate job once, and my boss, who was one of the executives, she showed me these figures about basically people were expected to have like 8.7 sick days a year on average. And I was just like, what? Are you crazy? And you just accept that. But of course, if you do accept that is the number, then if you can get that down to 4.7 sick days a year and spend less than 4 person days per, you know, then there is a commercial argument behind it. And if it's preserving the usefulness to the company of a trader, I guess they would give it some time and effort.
Yeah, and also because actually, if you think about people who do go off on long-term sick, like that is a huge cost and kind of drain to the to a company. And I know lots of those cases. I mean, I didn't. Once I was done, I was out. Oh, actually, the doctor said to me, like, you cannot go back to work. I'm like, please let me go back. No, don't go back to work. And I took a month off. The first time, it was March 2008. I took a month off. I'm like, this is how delusional I was at the time. I'm like, I'll take a month off. I'll just rest for a month. And clearly not really the type of person that rests that well. I'll be fine after a month and then I'll go back. And actually, by the end of that month, I realized like there is no going back. And the doctor's like, you cannot go back. So I didn't do.
It's also a difficult thing to kind of come to terms with, because when you're working somewhere for so long and you're successful at what you do and you're happy with what you do, the fallout from leaving that is there's so many different things that kind of click off. There's the who am I, what am I, how do I do what I do without doing this? There's then the I don't feel like I'm a useful, profitable person within society if I'm not doing X. Because you really do tie yourself in. I don't know if it's the same for banking or for women, but as a man, a lot of how I'm measured by society is by what I'm able to generate, what I'm able to create. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
And
I measure you by your profanities, mate. If that's any. But no, look. You spend the reality is you spend so much of your waking hours in that identity, especially in something like trading. But similarly, if you're entrepreneurial, how can it not be tied to your identity? You know, you have to, continually remind yourself that there are other things. I get criticized because I was laughing earlier on this year because we had a meeting with a guy who he doesn't want to sell his portfolio, which is unfortunate when you're in a meeting about selling his portfolio, right? But his wife does want him to sell his portfolio. So he's the sort of creator side of things and has done it 40 odd years, architect by background. She is left with the property management. So you can see where the division of labour might well, and she's fed up right now. There's way more money than they'll ever know what to do with. They've got no idea no estate planning in place. The whole thing's a complete mess from that perspective, right? But she wants to go, and I'd say it's when you see a couple and you're often, subconsciously or consciously trying to gauge who wears the trousers. Well, the trousers kept being passed around in this conversation. It's one of the more interesting ones that I've ever seen. And I was like, I wonder who's going to win the arm wrestle, because at some point it has to be sold. And I think we were looking at something like there was north of £5 million going to HMRC if they both got run over on the way outside of the meeting. He was knocking 70, she was knocking 60, so plenty of time in there to sort it out, but no idea about what. And he just turned to me and he said, the thing is, he said, I don't have hobbies, right? I don't like golf. It's boring. I don't think. And it made me laugh, because I thought, do you know what? In a different world, not that different, really. I could see myself sitting in that seat in 25 years' time, because my critique from my friends often is like, you don't have any hobbies. I'm like, macro counts as a hobby. And
how dare you?
It's a gigantic hobby. I just take it relatively seriously, It's you love what you do, you won't work a day in your life, sort of thing. It's like, yeah, but it's still bloody difficult to have a day off if you love what you do. That's the other problem. So cuts both ways, doesn't it? But how could you? Would you even encourage people to disassociate their identity with what they do for a living? I don't know.
The thing is, people are going to find one way or another to pin something onto their personality. So, the more popular thing at the moment is your personality is now intrinsically and solely linked to your sex or your gender. That's the popular puppy at the moment. Everybody loves a bit of that. Back in the day, it used to be more your identity is what you do or what you're good at, right? Yeah. So that may be a sports, it may be your job, it may be womanizing, it may be gold digging, it could be anything, right? If you're good at it, you're good at it. And the way people introduce themselves, you ask people to write themselves a 30-second elevator pitch. And those first 10 seconds is exactly who they think they are. Now, you take that 30-second elevator pitch and you throw it away and you sit them in front of 5 of their friends and you say, describe X for me. There is likely to be, apart from the fillers of the, there, the, and the, nothing is probably going to be anything close to what they've told you about themselves. True. So it's not just context, it's also the concept of things, how people view themselves versus how other people view them. Right. I think we ended the call last week with me, ripping off Seneca by saying, we suffer more in imagination than we do in reality. Right. And it's the same thing. Our own thoughts will try and predict how things are going to turn out or who we think we are. The reality is probably very, very, very far from that. Right. You'd be surprised the amount of people that would lose massive amounts of confidence in themselves if they heard what other people thought of them. And the converse is true. How much confidence someone would get by someone going, actually, I think you're amazing. And the amount of times that we don't hear that about ourselves is probably more than the amount of times that we don't say it about somebody else. And maybe a little bit more of that would go a long, long way.
I think that's very, very, very wise words indeed.
Yeah, it's true. The identity thing, though, is really, that did really hit me, and I wasn't prepared for that when I left banking. It's like, because it's funny, isn't it? Like the things, it's where you start to understand, or I did understand all the kind of the limiting beliefs or beliefs that you tell yourself, or that are in there that you've been programmed with, and just accept yourself and being productive. Like as a kid, it was always like, make yourself useful, make yourself useful, make yourself useful. So the moment you're in bed 20 hours a day and you are not useful, like all types of self-sabotaging thoughts came in. So it really did affect not only my physical health, but my mental health at the time. I'm not this banker, I'm not, JP Morgan, I'm not. We'd bought and actually it's exactly what you say. You just transfer it to something else. So we just bought like the massive house in central London. And then that became like my baby. And then that was what I was all about, like this house and this project, and all of me then went into that. And then when the relationship ended and we had to sell that house, I'm like, oh, here we are again. And I couldn't let go of that house because that house was then tied up with my identity. So the knots you get yourself into, we do as, you know, as humans, and the human condition is amusing.
I mean, I feel a bit of that, but especially in relation to the am I useful? I'm still maybe 80% up from where I was 2 or 3 months ago, because I spent like 2.5, 3 months on the sofa. I haven't put the baby to bed since April, and I used to do that. That used to be my thing. Like I would settle her for the night, so I can't get on the floor to get back up again at the moment. So that really hit me. It wasn't just the fact that I'm not very useful in terms of like doing stuff around the house, because let's face it, I'm not a DIYer by any stretch of the imagination. But that kind of got to me a little bit as well. I'm kind of like, I'm not as useful to the baby. I'm not as useful to the wife. I'm not as productive around the house. Then I wasn't as productive around the business for a month to 6 weeks. That really started to hit me. And it's just one of those things that you kind of, like you say, you start to kind of take on some negative, self-destructive kind of thoughts. But fortunately, I've been through that before, and I kind of caught myself, and I was like, no, we don't take a turn down that road. That leads to absolutely nowhere. You follow that, and sometimes when you start thinking a certain way, and then you start actually approving of those thoughts, then you start to feel better, because you're like, yeah, I'm right. I feel like that, blah, 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 blah. And the reality is that it makes you feel good as you're going down it. But the moment you snap out of those thoughts, you realize where you are, like, this is terrible. Yeah. So now I'm really quite, not just hard on myself. I'm really just quite, no. I know where that thought process leads. That's no good for anybody. It's not good for me. It's not good for anyone around me. And there's a responsibility for having a wife, a child, a house, all this kind of stuff, where it's you can't be self-indulgent in those kind of thoughts. And that in and of itself can be a bad thing, because there are some times where I think I'm being self-indulgent, and there's sometimes I think, actually, maybe I should just step back for 5 minutes and take a breath, right? Because you don't want to just be pushing through for the sake of pushing through, because you don't know what boundaries you're pushing yourself through. You could end up in a real shitty situation, right? So
you know what, we had our boardroom club this week. It's always my favourite day of the working month, right? And we had a really long and frank chat about a lot of this sort of stuff, because at the moment, first thing I was trying to do was put it into context and say, look, step back, go back to where we started this call today. The news at the moment, I mean, look, news by definition is bad news generally, because good news, that's why they have the cat rescued from the tree at the end, just to try and cheer you up at the end, right? But it is particularly bad at the moment in terms of the bearishness of it. And it is particularly inaccurate, it seems, in terms of how bearish they are as well, in general, right? So, first of all, you're being conditioned into it by society / the media / whatever. Second of all, a little bit of what Jay was just saying reminded me of it, right? Be kind to yourself, right? Find 5-10 minutes a day. We've got busy lives, right? I've got 3 little kids. You have to find those minutes. And there's an element of where you have to force yourself to be selfish if you are the identity of the provider, the giver, the go-getter, the top performer, whatever you want to call it, right? If you aren't looking after yourself, you won't be able to fulfill any of those functions, right? So for years and years and years, I didn't do that. And now it's part of my morning routine to make sure that I do that. And some of that was inspired or was given the room to develop thanks to COVID. Because there was that opportunity, and there was also a need for considering taking vitamins. I never really considered it before, but there were, reasons to be certainly taking certain vitamin supplements while all that was going on that were valid, that are habits that I've kept up. It's just that 15 minutes of routine or whatever that can exist in the morning. And then it's a bit like, you can't sit at the desk for 8 hours and not move and put in 8 hours of world-class work. You're much better off to get up and walk around for 15 minutes every 2 hours or however you do it, and actually your productivity will still go up, because all you're doing otherwise is marking time and being present, but you're not delivering at the level that you can. So, you know, being kind to yourself and finding time to be good to yourself is another one of those things. And I think the other one is, you know, don't be in denial around things that lifestyle habits that you have. And this is, everybody does it. So it's a really easy thing to say and a hard thing to do. It's like, oh, I don't feel very. I got one of these Oura rings a while ago, which is like, you know, it tracks your sleep and it's really quite accurate. I've been wearing it for a couple of months, and it's been helpful because apart from anything else, it's helping me to understand my sleep debt when I'm in my sleep overdraft, let's say, and also feel less bad if I do manage to have a really good night's sleep, which is rare, but if I do, you know, it feels better. It puts everything into context, so it's giving. You know, I'm someone who likes to measure stuff and the data, and that won't surprise anybody, you know. And these things are getting much better and much more accurate around all of that stuff. But there's no point wearing the ring and then, you know, breakfast, lunch, and dinner at McDonald's or whatever, because you know, so you need to be honest with yourself about, we all have our frailties, right? But also, good. We should have our frailties. There should be a day a week where we can do what we want, or however you manage that side of your personality. You deserve it. You owe it to yourself. You can't live like a monk. You can't. It's a bit like the 5 a.m. club doesn't help with this sort of stuff, does it? Really? Because it's like, because if you're not doing it, you weakling or whatever. That's how you're inevitably made to feel. Whereas really, it's like, it's not just I won't say the word I was going to say because I'm trying to keep the fantasies out today myself, but it's not just a contest of who can urinate the furthest, let's say, because we can all start getting up at, I'll just schedule some Facebook posts saying I'm up at 1:45 or something. So I mean, what's the bloody point? You know, you work to your, one of the good things about the Oura ring, you know, it works out your chronotype if you don't already know, although you probably do. I'm lucky to be a morning person, so it's a lot easier for me to get up at 5:30 and deliver. Whereas some people, if you prize them up at 5:30, they'll be rubbish, right? Similarly, if you want something out of me, get it out of me at 10 o'clock at night. It's not the way forward because I'm slitheringly useless, you know?
I do love those things. And obviously we are data geeks, but I love those things where exactly you can have context and you can have data and you can understand yourself. So I did that. I did a test earlier in January this year. This Dutch cycle mapping, it's called, and just getting some feedback. And when it came back, my dopamine was at the lowest of the range, and I can't remember, it was 3 to, I can't remember if it was 60 or 90. My dopamine level was 3, was the bottom of that range. And at that point I'm like, yes, I felt depressed all year. I knew there was no, I wasn't kind of mentally, like psychologically depressed. There was no reason to be depressed, but when that came back, I'm like, okay, that's why I felt shit all year. And the answer for me then wasn't like, oh, go on antidepressants because that doesn't tackle dopamine. But I'm like, but I've got a functional like medicine lady. So we've got all my supplements and what can boost that. And also what little measures, as you say, during the day can do that. So now I first thing up, out, coffee, swim, and I swim at the end of the day, just little things like that. But without that data, but I was like, all year, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? Nothing was fucking wrong. Pardon my French. Nothing was wrong with me in my, you know, I wasn't depressed, but I had a biological, physiological symptom that it took me a year to work out what it was.
Yeah, the other thing we added in was, you know, try a 45-minute walk in the sunlight if possible, because that makes so much difference to people. Now, you know, it's so much easier at this time of year to do that. It's December and you look at, you know, I'm sure you know the stats around, you know, is it Finland where it's dark for 3 months in a row or something? And there's a very high suicide rate, and it's very, very difficult. There's a very, very high rate of depression. again, this is a physiological condition. It's not an accident. So probably if you live in Finland, I don't suppose you're watching this if you live in Finland, but if you do, I'm sure there are ways to get artificial sunlight substitutes during that time of year, whether that's supplements, as Helen was just saying, or lamps or whatever it is. This is why these lights and this lighting is so important, you know, so important, especially if you're craning and looking at screens and I mean, show me the person who's not looking at screens, right? I mean, come on, unless they're Amish, there's not a lot of chance, is there really?
Well,
I tell you what, I would recommend. I don't recommend. Oh, God.
So I was just going to say, someone had introduced themselves this morning. I don't know on whose LinkedIn, but Caroline says, "Good morning from Iceland."
Oh, there we go.
There you go. I thought that was pertinent, but no, take it away, Helen.
Hi, Caroline. I don't recommend like general things. Like I say, I think things are very individual. The one thing I would do, because I've just, again, something I've realized in a recent blood test myself, everybody go and get your vitamin D levels checked, particularly if you're in the UK or Iceland. I live in Malta. Look at, actually, you can't tell how tanned I am. Look at the color of me. I live in the sun. My vitamin D levels are kind of mid-range. You think I would be off the charts at the top end of vitamin D? I'm not. And if you don't have vitamin D, not only does it affect bones and things, it's a very big effect on mental health and for immunity. So now I'm living in the sun and I'm taking a vitamin D supplement. So honestly, it's such a cheap test. Go on.
As I understand the sort of the scientific debate around it at the moment is effectively that the recommended daily allowance of vitamin D has been vastly underestimated for many years, and people are saying you need to try and get 1,000 to 1,500% of the theoretical RDA in, because it's just not enough. Now, obviously, as Helen says, you've got to check this stuff out for yourself. Absolutely. Invest the time in you, because the rewards are the highest rewards you'll ever get from anything. It's the best ROI you can imagine, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think we're now running it. It's now 10:14, so that we need to be considerate that people probably have lives outside of listening to us, which is a brilliant investment, if you ask me. But let's close it off with top 3 tips for just dealing with mindset or mental health from each of us, and then we can sign off and let people hopefully get on with their week. So Helen, ladies first.
Top list, it sounds trite, but it's a way of retraining your brain. Gratitude list. Get up, write down 3 things first thing in the morning, or when you open your eyes, or even just think about it. It's better if you write it down. 3 things you're grateful for, and actually last thing at night. And at first you feel like, oh God, this is so like, oh. Honestly, it's retrain. It is rewiring your brain every day that you do that. I said the other one, vitamin D, and the other one I would say, like, just take mini pauses during the day. Literally, there's a little exercise you do. You sit down and you rub your 2 fingers together and you concentrate on what that feels like. And again, like at the time, you're like, what on earth am I doing? But for 2 minutes, it just gives yourself like that. It gives your nervous system a break from the incessant screen, the noise, the whatever else is going on. And again, it's not like 2 minutes, that 2 minutes is life-changing, but it is over time if you can do that 2 or 3 times a day.
Lovely.
Awesome.
Mr. Lawrence?
I think I would say, number 1, start with you, because not enough people do, and they let other people get in. That can be the energy vampires and the time vampires stealing your space or whatever. You've got to start with you. I would say age-appropriate exercise. So accept that, especially someone like me, I played rugby to a decent level. I was a power lifter. I'm not any of those things anymore, for those who know me in person, nor will I be, because realistically, I've probably passed the big 4-0 some years ago. So ultimately, age-appropriate stuff. Walking's fantastic. Right, it doesn't need to be high intensity interval train. Doesn't need to be all of that sort of stuff, But get your steps in, and I would say get into your wearables, right? Even if it's just a basic smartwatch or the health thing on your phone. Your phone's got one on in 90+% of smartphones these days. get into it and the data inside it, because that is more important than the rate of inflation. That's my affirmation in the morning, Helen. Your step count is more important than the headline rate of inflation.
Okay, good. My three.
Jay, what's yours?
I think it's important to be part of a community. So whether that is your local environment, I'm looking for somewhere to volunteer at the moment. So I've applied for a couple of volunteer positions. I want to get more into community, because I want to feel. I don't want just, obviously Hammered is great. I don't want just Hammered and the Buyers Club and those things to be everything outside of the home. I want to be able to do more and provide more and do more. And I think feeling wanted and needed and appreciated, you need to put yourself in those environments where you are wanted, needed and appreciated. And the wanted, needed sounds like they're the more important, but the appreciated is the biggest part. If you're not feeling appreciated where you are, the other two things,
there's nothing more demotivational than being taken for granted, is there? There's nothing more demotivational.
Yeah. So community is the first one. The second one is communication. I think you need people that you can just call up and communicate with. I've got a couple of people where the sole communication is we send each other the most horrendous memes and jokey things and have a bit of a smile, and that happens once or twice a day. But it's just like a really good outlet. It's a reciprocal thing. There's probably 3 or 4 people I send some ridiculous crap to. Definitely send some ridiculous things to Helen. She's still a friend, so that seems to be working. But communication, it can be in several different ways. You don't need to set up a support group. It's just knowing that there is an outlet that you can just talk to somebody. You have that. I think that's really important. And the third, I think, is just being kind to yourself. I think it's something that Adam mentioned earlier on. Yeah. But, I had it written down on here somewhere. And I don't think it's been taken down. I've got all these little things, what you're committed to affects what you see. Hardest choices require the greatest wills. Whereas have compassion for yourself as a human being. That's the one I was looking for. That's probably the third one. Just remember that you're human. Just remember that not all of your thoughts are great. If you had bad thoughts, it doesn't make you a bad or evil person. All of these kind of things, and it kind of circles back to the whole context. But just have compassion for yourself.
Community, communication, and compassion. How wonderfully alliterative, Mr. Howard. I think you take that one. You take that one hands down for me, my friend. Very well done.
That would make a great post, Jay.
Oh, you know what? The fact that seems to have resonated with you both, I will do a post about the 3 C's.
Look forward to it.
Cool.
All right, guys. Well, I'm hoping that we haven't completely cocked this entire thing up, and that the sounding has worked. It's streamed ever it's supposed to stream. No doubt Piotr will tell me if I've made a mistake, but we're going to let you get on with the rest of your day. We hope you have a fantastic week, and we look forward to having you back with us next Sunday.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Cheers, everyone.